Hello and welcome to Shoot the Breeze, where we take a nostalgic look at a random football magazine from the past. I'm Andy Smith, aka Scott's Footy Cards on Twitter, and with me is Tom Brogan.
Hello.
In each episode we'll invite a special guest to join us in trawling through the magazine and discuss anything contained within it. This could be anything from an article, to a photograph, to a competition, to an advert. Basically, if it's in it, then we'll talk about it. So sit back and let's shoot the breeze.
Wriggles clear, might just get the chip, and he does, he's scored! Oh, what a great backlash! He's done it! Oh, brilliant! Wiggling his way, that's an excellent one, and Didi! It's a goal, that's four for Clydebank. Excellent play by Hughes. I think the player of the match, and sweetly finished by Penny.
And this week our guest is Steve Tongue. Steve is a sports journalist and broadcaster for 45 years. Steve launched Foul in 1972, which was the first football fanzine. He's worked for 3 national newspapers, covered 9 World Cups, 2 Olympic Games, and he's the author of a number of books, including Turf Wars, A History of London Football, Lancashire Turf Wars, A Football History, and the latest one in the series, West Midlands Turf Wars. Thanks so much for coming along, Steve.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on, Steve. We've picked out a Shoot magazine from the 16th of May for us to look at. So we'll do as we normally do and just start from the front cover. So the front cover is dominated by a colourful photo which shows Tommy Murray of Carlisle in an all-red kit being challenged by Queen's Park's Tony Hazel. Now it looks as though, I think that's Rodney Marsh in the background as well. And QPR are in their famous blue and white hoop kit. The accompanying caption says that Murray is shrugging off a tackle, and it does look as though there's been a bit of contact that's taken place. The pitch, while flat, does look bereft of the green stuff, so I think that's probably a bit later on in the season. Tommy Murray, he was a Scottish footballer who played with Airdrie and Hearts, with Carlisle sandwiched in between. He also had a spell in Australia before returning to Scotland and playing for Broth and Raith Rovers. The QPR player pictured, Tony Hazel, played 369 league games for QPR before moving to Millwall in 1974, where he'd spent the next 4 years. He then moved to Palace before finishing up at Charlton between 79 and 81. Now, the headings on the front page are George at his best in full colour, which is a 2-page spread inside with photos of Man United's George Best. We'll have a look at that. What's What in Football, a fact-filled series that every fan will want to collect. This is part 1 of a football A to Z. This week obviously focuses on the letter A. And the cover price is 1 shilling, the equivalent of 12 pence at the time. So it's a very colourful front page photo. Is there anything we want to look at or spot from there?
Well, I'm guessing because Carlisle are in red rather than blue, that it's actually taken at Loftus Road, where it would mean, looking up that year that they were playing towards the end of March, it will be a second division game because QPR, having got to the first division, of course, for the first time in their history, had had a disastrous season and been relegated straight away after 1 year. And it wasn't a particularly successful season, this 69 to 70 for either team. They were both in the middle of the table. And so I suspect that the goalless draw at Loftus Road was not the most exciting game of the season. Tony Hazel, of course, became quite famous in another way, in that Terry Venables would have played in that QPR team. He was at Rangers at the same time. And Terry, a man, of course, who always wanted to try different things, very innovative in many ways, and ended up writing books with Gordon Williams, the Scottish author, wrote the very futuristic novel They Used to Play on Grass, which, of course, looked ahead many years before it actually happened to a time when league football was played on artificial pitches, and ironically, of course, in the first place at QPR at Loftus Road. And when Gordon Williams and Terry then turned to detective fiction, they titled their character Hazel, with exactly the same spelling, a male character, a male Hazel, not a female one. And I think we can tell from that photo and from QPR at the time exactly where they got the title from, and became very successful. Gordon Williams, I'm sure people would have heard of. the author, of course, of Straw Dogs, famously, the novel on which the film was based. So, yes, Tony Hazel, quite a character in his own way. As you say, quite a bit of a 1970s challenge. There's arm on the shoulder and the knee going into the side, and quite an aggressive old 70s defender of what was nevertheless one of my favourite teams of the period. They were on their way down a little bit at that time, having got relegated. But in my London book, I actually suggested they were possibly the best third division team of all time, and the team that got to the Football League Cup final, the first one at Wembley in '67, when they came back to beat West Brom at the top division after being 2-0 down. It was a terrific team with Rodney Marsh, the Morgan twins on the wing, and Mark Lazarus, and Tony Hazel at the back as well. A really good third division team who were terrific entertainers as well. Sadly, by 1970, as I say, just on the way down, and players like Rodney Marsh, of course, would be moved on.
Let's jump inside then, onto pages 2 and 3. So in this we have readers have a last chance to vote for the most exciting player of the year, and they're advised to turn to page 32 and vote today. Everything's with exclamation marks, obviously, to stress the point. The trophy for the winner is shown, and we'll take a look at this later in the magazine. Now, over the rest of the pages 2 and 3 is a feature called Shooting Around, which is compiled by Howard Elson. This features a number of smaller stories from around football in the UK. Would Howard Elson be a name that you recognise?
Not me, no. There are one or two later on who I knew quite well, contributors, journalistic contributors. The story that jumped out at me really was the record-making soccer star, the Aston Villa player Dick Edwards, who had just cut a disc, his debut disc, 1 million miles away, considering giving up football to become a pop singer. I did actually check my Guinness Book of Hit Singles, and I'm afraid 1 million miles away appears to have ended up 1 million miles away from the charts, because he didn't quite make it. And he didn't actually have much of a career after that. He went on to Torquay and then came back to Mansfield. Villa, of course, were interesting at that time because having throughout nearly all of my youth been a top first division side, and one of the great names in English football, got relegated not just to the second division but then to the third division when Tommy Doherty was the manager, which got him the sack. And was really a sensation at the time that a club like Villa should go down, and ironically were relegated along with Preston North End, another of the great names of English football. You know, the first ever season of the Football League, Preston and Aston Villa, the top two in the Football League. And the latest book you mentioned, I've done the West Midlands book, quotes Aston Villa at the turn of the century, the end of the 19th century. They were being talked about as the biggest football club in the world. Of course, there weren't all that many leagues around the world, and unfortunately, there weren't any games in which they could prove it, unlike later when they won the European Cup and could actually compete for the World Club Championship. But Villa were, at that time, they were definitely the biggest club in England in terms of playing success, and they still had that lovely stadium, which became the current Villa Park, and clearly were a huge club. So it's difficult to underestimate all this. What are we on? 50 years on. Difficult to underestimate what a shock it was when Villa should go down to the third division, and indeed didn't get back immediately. It took them 2 seasons to get back, but when they did, they were shown to be much too good for the third division. I think they had one crowd of either 46,000 or 48,000 in the third division, which must be very close to the record for the third division. But Dick Edwards, I'm afraid, didn't. It says Aston Villa had paid £30,000 for it 2 years ago, which in those days was still a reasonable fee. But he didn't really make much of a name either as a footballer or, sadly, as a pop singer.
I looked him up as well, and apparently he was a country musician. It says he was a country musician, and he actually made the number 1 in the American country charts in 1988. And he's
right.
Yeah, so he's still recently he was performing with his 2 sons in a band as well, and it mentions that he released a song called War Cry while he was at Torquay as well, which was a Torquay's song. So that was in 1972. So that was a couple of years after this article. this magazine. So he obviously did move on from Aston Villa to Torquay. The American country charts in 1988. I tried to find a copy of it and see what it was like, but I couldn't find that, I'm afraid. There was a good few articles on him, being, more recent articles on his singing history as well. So he's managed to make it a little bit over in the States. So well done to him, I think.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
The other one to point out here, just go back one. Here we go. So for sale, one football team. So I wanted to have a look at this one. So 4th Division Chester have put all their players up for sale in order to keep their heads above water. Secretary Mr. S. Gandy says, at present we need £7,000 to break even. However, he doesn't anticipate having to sell the entire team, but does think that they will have to sell at least 3. It shows a photo of the goalkeeper Terry Carling, and he would move to Macclesfield in 1971, so the following year. So it looks as though the goalkeeper was one of the ones to go away and help save the club, or keep the club going. So I thought that was interesting, just basically putting up the entire team and saying, listen, we need to sell 3 of them. I guess Chester are one of these teams that have, that's the sort of area of finances that they're generally around. But I thought that was quite interesting as well.
Yeah, they weren't the worst. I mean, they finished halfway up the league that season in the 4th division, and the crowds I looked up were about 4,500, and there were a lot in worse states than them. But that was always the problem of that sort of level, of course. I don't know how many players they did end up selling, but they survived for a while, and actually within, I think, 4 or 5 years of this, about 1975, they got promoted back up to the 3rd division. But they've always been one of those, for quite a big, quite a reasonable city, maybe haven't achieved what they should have. The latest controversy, I don't know if you caught that, was because the stadium is literally part of it in England and part of it in Wales. They've been having a great row about COVID restrictions because, of course, in Wales, until next week at least, they're allowing no supporters in at all. So Wales were claiming that they shouldn't be allowing any fans in because the ground was in Wales. And Chester were claiming that because the main entrance is in England, they should be entitled to get some supporters in, which of course they're desperate to do. So they are one of those teams who've often been on the brink in many different ways.
I haven't heard that, but that's quite an interesting one as well. Next one is Jimmy Greaves. It's Shooter pointing out that in 6 league games for West Ham last season, he scored a total of 4 goals, whereas in the Spurs 28 games previous to that, he scored twice as many goals. So I guess they're just pointing out that he's scoring more goals for West Ham. What's your memories of Jimmy?
Well, happened to be at White Hart Lane for one of his greatest goals, which was often shown on TV at the time that sadly passed away, which was the one against Manchester United, where he picked up the ball with his back to goal very close to the halfway line and seemed to go through most of the Manchester United team before going round the goalkeeper and scoring. That was a great day for Spurs. They beat a very good United team 5-1 that day. And that was when he was in his pomp. That was probably 64, 65. By 1970 and the move to West Ham, he was unfortunately on the way down. I mean, it was a part exchange deal, if you remember, for Martin Peters, and Spurs undoubtedly got the better of that deal. And Martin Peters, as I think we'll see later in some of the transfer fees, was rated much more highly in terms of the money. Jimmy had started drinking pretty heavily, I think, at that time. And while he had maybe this 1 or 2 good seasons for West Ham and could always be relied on to knock in a few goals, as it says, he was sadly well past his peak and ended up playing for some quite small teams around London just for the love of the game, people like Woodford Town and Barnet, who people might know a bit more about, just to keep on going. But sadly, he was on the downward spiral, in personally and professionally, really, by this time almost.
Yeah. So the next one on the page, you've already touched on it. It's talking about Aston Villa's average crowds and saying, although relegated from Division 2 last season, they boasted the best average crowd of the whole division at just over 27,000, which is remarkable, isn't it? It's even looking at Huddersfield and Blackpool, which they say just over 16,000 each. I think they'd be pretty happy with those sort of crowds these days.
Yeah, they would these days. I mean, those were the 2 promoted clubs, as you say, Huddersfield and Blackpool. And it did illustrate the pulling power of Villa even at that time. And as I say, they would have got bigger crowds in the third division for both seasons, because inevitably, people would rather go and see a winning team, as they were generally in the third division, than one struggling at the bottom. Wasn't enough to save Tommy Docherty, but it did very well for them in the third division, and their average, I haven't checked it, but their average crowd that season when they won the championship 2 years later at the third division must have been very close to a record for that division.
So the last one I'm going to look at on these 2 pages is, the title says, Celtic's big hitting bomber explodes onto the scene, and it's a fresh-faced Lou McCarrie who's pictured. He's at Celtic. It says he's just broken through from the Celtic reserves the previous season, having scored 42 goals in total. Now, I presume that most of those are for the reserves, because when I checked, they'd only scored 9 goals for the first team, so they must be including the reserve goals in that as well. Does that sound about right, Tom?
Yeah, that's what I was looking at. I think he only scored about 56 goals in his whole Celtic career, so yeah, I would assume that they were including reserve goals. Yeah.
Going to say Lewis McCarrie, I believe we should Louis McCarrie maybe as he's titled. He obviously wasn't all that well known. The 5'5" dynamo. I think by that time they probably still had a good view of the Lisbon Lions, didn't they? Playing Jimmy Johnston and Wallace and Lennox and people, and they just won the title again for about the 5th year running. And it does it say he scored the goal in the semi-final, in the cup semi-final? And I think he got on in the final, which then actually, rather surprisingly, perhaps they lost to Aberdeen. But one of the things I didn't know about him for many years was that although he was born in Aberdeen, he came to London at a very young age, only about 1 year old, which may explain why he doesn't really have that Scottish accent at all. And oddly, or ironically, ended up living very close to Upton Park, where, of course, he then later became a manager of West Ham. A great career, of course, after Celtic got the chance to go to either Man United or Liverpool, and settled for United with Tommy Docherty, I think, at the time. And then a very reasonable managerial career, West Ham, Swindon, and Stoke. And funnily enough, just been reading about him this week in none other than The Big Issue, because I don't know if people know, he does this terrific work with the homeless in Stoke, and it was concentrating on that. Not only takes in homeless people, but he's got a whole place with different individual pods that they can sleep in, and is doing terrific work there in Stoke.
Yeah, it's remarkable the work that he puts in. As you sort of touched on there, a lot of people don't know about it, which I guess that's not why he does it, but really a lot of people should know about it and know the work that he does put in for that. But you pointed out that it says Lewis McCarrie there. I didn't even spot that, and normally I'm an eagle eye with these sort of things, so thanks for pointing that out to me. But what's interesting about the article, it suggests that Celtic almost lost him to Wolves because they hadn't offered them a full-time contract, but as soon as Wolves came, I think it basically kicked Celtic into making a move and saying, okay, we're going to offer you, and the rest is history. So we'll move on to pages 4 and 5, and this is Bobby Moore writes for you. It says, the season ends but the game goes on. Soccer is an all year round sport now. The West Ham's Bobby Moore talks about how footballers no longer have a prolonged period off in the summer between seasons. He mentions that he and some of his teammates had to take jobs mending roads and unloading lorries during the summer break to make up the wages from the club, which were reduced during the period. Nowadays the football never stops, says Bobby, from the World Cup, club and international tours and coaching abroad. They now have only a few weeks in the summer to relax with their families. And he also pays tribute to the hard-working British groundsmen who perform miracles to get the pitches back to perfection in time for the new season. And he also finally mentions that players generally don't have a clue what's going on behind the scenes when it comes to the comings and goings of players. It's one of the things that Tom and I, we go through a lot of these magazines from different period, and they're quite open. Back then, players were quite open about talking about the game, about talking about what happens in it. Nowadays it's all, it's a sort of, as I'm sure you're aware, that it's like the stock answers that you get. It's cliches and things like that. But the great thing about back here was you could actually learn a bit about what actually goes on in the game, and it was absolutely fascinating to hear that these players are out digging up roads and loading vehicles and stuff like that. That's I mean, we know for a fact that wouldn't happen nowadays.
No, it was an interesting piece, and from somebody who really was never a great controversialist. I'm sure you've come across many of these sort of ghosted columns in the magazine because they were a staple part of it. I think I'm right that Goal magazine started about a year before Shoot. Goal got Bobby Charlton, another person who really wasn't ever going to say anything terribly controversial, but if he could be brought out a bit, would have interesting things to say nevertheless, and factual things. I suspect Bob might have been quite hard work to get it's quite a big 2-page spread in there, and he might have been hard work some weeks to get too much out of. But it was an interesting piece. I came across him quite a lot in his later years when, of course, he was a radio pundit. He worked for Capital Gold, the mainly London station, so I'd often see him in the London press boxes. A lovely man, almost goes without saying. But again, and became quite a decent radio pundit, but again, not somebody who was ever really going to make headlines. But as I'm sure, again, you notice from these old magazines, and we'll see later, even in this issue, there are topics which come up again and again, like the amount of football that people have to play. He talks about Wolves and West Ham and others going over to tournaments in America in the close season rather than having a long break and so on, and other features which we'll come across later.
Okay, so moving on, there's a quick quiz here, and I'm going to just pick out one of these questions because it'll give an idea of how difficult this quiz could be. So the question is, the name of a First Division club can be found from the following 4 words. See if you can find it. And the words are wet, used, ham, tin. I mean, one of the words hasn't even been changed, has it? So I think...
Wet ham was a pretty good clue, to be honest.
Yeah.
Also, when any quiz where the answers are printed at the bottom of the page, even when it's upside down, you do tend to do quite well. I see whoever's done this quiz claims to have got about 16 out of 20, so they've done pretty well. But how legitimate that was, we will never know.
Yeah. On to page 7, views from the stars. So this is three top soccer personalities talk about changes they would welcome in the game. I think that's an interesting phrase to use, personalities. I don't know that we would use that nowadays. So the 3 personalities are Liverpool's Peter Thompson, Arsenal's Bob Wilson, Leicester City's David Nish. And I'm going to pick out a few of the questions. Peter Thompson. So the first question I'm going to look at is, how do you think the present transfer system could be improved? Peter Thompson believes the transfer market has gone crazy, and that if it's players who do not remain loyal to a club who are being rewarded. He'd like to see those who remain loyal being compensated. Bob Wilson reckons a spending cap should be placed on clubs, and David Nish is pragmatic, saying that the reason the prices are so high is there are so many clubs and so few players. It's a case of demand and supply. Look at the next one. What single change would you make in soccer? Peter Thompson suggests that he would like to see fewer games. Bob Wilson would like professional referees and more ex-players going into the refereeing. And David Nish would like more consistency in refereeing, possibly echoing Bob Wilson's comments. Number 4, do you think suspension should be imposed for a period of games or as present days? And we all agree that it should be a period of games. And the last one I'm going to look at is, what has been the most significant change in soccer during the 1960s? Peter Thompson references the fact that players no longer wear a fixed number based on their position, and fans have had to educate themselves on this. Bob Wilson thinks there are now more players in a team capable of playing in a general attacking and defending position rather than a fixed position. He says that the goalkeeper and centre-back are the only 2 old-school positions that remain. And David Nish bemoans the loss of wingers, which he puts down to Sir Alf Ramsey, as other clubs have followed his lead. So I guess there's a few themes throughout that, isn't there? about refereeing. I mean, we could ask the same question today and we'll get the same answers from that. Refereeing. The interesting one is about players playing in specific, and I've all, this has come up quite a few times, and I always find it fascinating that it confused people when players wore a different number in a different position from what they were playing, and that just seems really alien as opposed to us nowadays. But I
think there was, in terms of the media, there was very little comment or coverage about tactical things in those days, partly because the papers in those, if you look at the very old newspapers, they had so little space compared to what there is today. I mean, there weren't any 24-page football supplements on a Saturday or a Monday that people had to fill.
Yeah.
And so there was very little sophistication, I think, among football fans, and they expected that shirt numbers actually meant something, and that you had number 5, you were a big centre half who played at the back, and if, as Peter Thompson says, if you were 7 or 11, you played on the wing. If you were 7, you were supposed to be on the right, and if you were 11, you're supposed to be on the left. And if you were found somewhere else, fans wanted to know what was going on. So that was an interesting one. I thought actually those 3 players were quite a good choice. Bob Wilson, of course, went on to become a professional media pundit, and David Nish I always thought was one of them, talks about supply and demand and the transfer market and so on. Whereas the other 2 just moan, as people have from the year dot, about crazy transfer prices, like they did when the first player was transferred for £1,000, and everyone said, "This is terrible. Where will it all stop?" David Nish, I thought was quite good on that. And what I was referring to earlier was that so many of these sort of questions could still be asked today. And obviously, on the price of transfers, people will be saying exactly the same thing. So some of them get changed, but not many. Bob Wilson, I'm sure, would still have wanted his professional referees, which we're not got either.
The last one about Sir Alf Ramsey, so saying that the loss of wingers, that's been mentioned a few times throughout the magazine as well, and I have heard about that before. So a lot of people weren't happy about how that changed the game in England.
No, that's right. And one of the things we'll note as we go further through the magazine was, of course, this was just in the run-up to the 1970 World Cup, at which point England were not really using wingers at all. In '66, as people generally know, he actually tried 3 different wingers in the group matches and wasn't convinced by any of them, and so basically put Alan Ball and Martin Peters in there as much more functional modern midfield players, and was convinced that we just didn't have the wingers to make it work. Whereas a lot of players in Scotland, you still had your Jimmy Johnstons and your George Best in Northern Ireland, and other countries still did have them, but Ramsey, for better or for worse, was convinced that we didn't. And of course, it's come and gone since then, and in many ways they've made a comeback, although with the slight difference, I suppose, that these days they're all expected to have defensive duties to do as well.
So the next page has 2 adverts in it. I'm just going to quickly look at them. First one is for Soccer Prints, and you can buy posters of individual players or teams for 4 shillings or 6 shillings. And the 2 team posters that are shown are West Brom and Man United. I guess things like that, there wouldn't have been a huge deal of merchandise really to choose from at this sort of point. More was coming in, but things like this would have been absolute manna from heaven for kids back then, I guess.
Yeah, some good old names on there. Bobby Tambling and Roger Hunton, Bobby Charlton and Jimmy Greaves. And interesting one at the bottom, Peter Knowles, who a lot of younger listeners may not remember at all, because, of course, having had a few good seasons and been a very talented player for Wolves, he suddenly decided he was going to retire and become a Jehovah's Witness, which was extraordinary. And everyone at Wolves was convinced that he would soon be back playing for them, but he stuck it out. And in fact, I read a very recent interview with him in which he said he never regretted it for a moment. So he continued along that path. And other interesting, one little one I noticed on the teams was that in alphabetical order they go Arsenal, Albion, Chelsea, because West Bromwich Albion, as mentioned above, the Manchester United poster there, had decided, I think almost for that reason, for alphabetical reasons, that they would drop the West Bromwich briefly, because rather like the teams who styled themselves AFC, Bournemouth or Wimbledon or someone, you got some sort of kudos by being further up the alphabet. I suppose actually they should have been ahead of Arsenal, shouldn't they, if they were doing it alphabetically? But that didn't last all that long. But some good familiar faces there, look like Jeff Astle and Albion, of course, holding up the FA Cup from 1968. And what stands out, I suppose, from Man United, apart from the obvious faces like Law and Best and Charlton, was manager at that time, Wilf McGuinness, actually with hair, which, of course, all dropped out, poor man, once the pressure of managing Manchester United got to him. Still a very popular figure around Old Trafford, became a United pundit, doing a lot of stuff for local radio and local TV up there, but with no hair whatsoever. It was perhaps the most graphic example ever of what the pressures of football management can do to a man, sadly.
Is it Peter Knowles that you mentioned there? Was that the one?
Peter Knowles.
Was it him that they kept his contract? Was that?
Yes, because as I say, they were. I think it was it Bill McCarrie at the time who was the manager. They were convinced that nobody would seriously give up professional football to go and knock on people's doorsteps, telling them about Jehovah, and he just carried on doing it and never regretted it. And he was a lovely player. He was a really flamboyant sort of inside forward who scored some great goals. I remember one. I don't know, it's funny, the things that do stick in your mind. A game they showed, a FA Cup game they showed at Portsmouth, that he scored this fantastic goal, just picked the ball up and almost literally kicked it out of the ground as a celebration. He really had that bit of flamboyance, was a real entertainer. It was just a real shock when he suddenly disappeared, but, to his credit, he stuck to his guns.
Fair play to him. So the second advert on this page is Elsie's for All Sports. This is Elsie Sports in Tottenham, London. And it's boys' football team outfits in colours of famous clubs. Footballs, 18 or 32 panel laceless balls. Goalkeeper outfits, superb nylon tracksuits and supporters bags. And as you would expect, they're all drawings rather than any sort of photographs of the gear that you're going to be buying. So... the fact that they're referring to the balls as laceless is sort of aging it as well, I guess. The pair of Puma boots on the goalkeeper by the looks of it. Is Elsie Sport, would that have been a well-known shop back then?
Well, I'm fascinated by the address for a reason I'll tell you, which is that you mentioned that I started a magazine called Foul, and the original concept was that it would be given away free at matches. Excuse me. The first game that we had in mind was a game at Tottenham. So I spent a lot of time traipsing up and down, literally that road, the high road, Tottenham, trying to sell adverts. And I must have missed a trick because I don't think Elsie Sports featured in it, but some very strange little shops in Tottenham High Road did. And in the end, we decided it just didn't work to try and give the magazine away, so we sold it for the princely sum of 5p instead. But the point you made earlier was good about the sort of marketing of sport, and the fact that this is a private company rather than any of the clubs. I mean, the clubs at that time, as far as I remember, were pretty hopeless about actual merchandising. And boys, as it says, it is very much marketed at boys and their football team outfits. And there were plenty of boys at that time, who would have loved to have had a strip in their own team colours, even though you didn't really wear them to matches. I mean, anybody wearing a shirt to a match in those days would have got a lot of strange looks and people asking him, what position are you playing, son, and that sort of thing. It wasn't really the done thing, unlike these days. But it was just surprising in a way that clubs took so long to realise, if nothing else, how much money there was to be made from this, as we see today from all the big clubs and the fantastic superstores which they all have and so on.
Well, I guess it would have taken them probably close to another decade to actually start doing things properly. I mean, it would have been the late 70s.
I think so, at least, yes. And where are we? 1970. The only thing, in contrast to it, I always remember I was very surprised that my first kit I was able to get in about the late 1950s. It happened to be a Wolverhampton Wanderers kit, a club to which I had no affinity whatsoever. But I obviously said I'd like a football kit for either Christmas or birthday. And somehow my parents managed to find a sports shop. We were living in the Midlands at the time, and so it could have been Wolves, or I suppose it could perhaps have been Villa. But it was that rather nice old Wolves kit of the old gold and the black. Of course, it was in those days. It was a big, heavy kit with a big collar and long sleeves and so on. Yeah. But I've actually got the photo of me aged 6 or 7 in this full Wolves kit, and I was a bit surprised looking back that even in those days you could get them. But again, it would have been very definitely from a sports shop rather than from a club. And I remember similarly trying to buy a Leyton Orient. We'd come on to Orient later, who happened to have been my club always. I remember years later trying to get a Leyton Orient shirt, and not only would the club not sell anything like that, but it was really hard, even from quite local sports outfitters, to find one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on the next page, there's a black and white photo of Rangers' Colin Steen in action against Cameron Murray of St Mirren. Now, Murray holds the record for the consecutive appearances for St Mirren, while Colin Steen, who started at Hibs before moving to Rangers in 1968, then went south with Coventry City in 72 before returning to Rangers in 1975. He made 21 Scotland appearances, scoring 9 times. Is Colin Steen someone you remember when he was down in England, or maybe even up in Scotland?
Yeah, very much. Cameron Murray, I'm afraid, wasn't. But no, Colin Steen I would associate with Coventry, and 2 or 3 seasons there. I think, a very good scoring record for Scotland, in particular in the home internationals. In the few games we used to get on television always featured the home internationals. You would get the FA Cup final, and then generally by this time the home international championship was always played at the end of the season, and they would show almost every game, and so obviously Scotland-England was the big one. But you would see those games, and his record in the home internationals, I think, was quite spectacular. The other thing I noted about him was scoring 4 goals for Scotland once in a World Cup qualifier, I think against Cyprus, and the last hat trick for Scotland, I think, for a very long time, 45, 46 years.
It was.
Yeah. But so I think a decent spell at Coventry would be quite well remembered there before, as you say, going back to Scotland.
Yeah. Moving on to page 10, we've got Ask the Expert, and they're going to pick a couple out. So this is the first mention of Orient, Leyton Orient, or Clapton Orient at the time. And so the question from David Taylor from East Ham in London is, has a league match ever been played at Wembley? So the reply from Shoot is yes. Orient, then known as Clapton Orient, played Brentford and Southend at Wembley in the third Division South in 1930-31 season, during a period when their own ground was not available.
Well, David Taylor, coming from East Ham in London, should have known that. He was obviously a West Ham fan rather than an Orient fan. There was a bizarre episode in which Orient, playing at Clapton Orient in the 1930s, had a complaint from one of the opposition. It may have been once they just moved to one of their new grounds in Clapton, that the pitch wasn't wide enough or similar. And so they were allowed to play these 2 games at Wembley, which may have been a mixed blessing. Playing Brentford, which of course is a club quite close to Wembley, they got a decent crowd. They got about 8,000 for that game. But then they played Southend soon afterwards, and the crowd was about 1,900. Which even in the Wembley of 1930 would have looked pretty sparse crowd. But they did win both games, I have to say, which is good. And whenever we mention Orient in this conversation, they are just Orient at this stage in 1970. Yeah. They'd been Leyton Orient, of course, when they moved at the end of the Second World War, but then had a row with the local council, Leyton Council, and as a sort of retaliation said, we're not going to be Leyton anymore, we're going to be playing Orient. And that went on for a few years into the early 70s when they got their Leyton back. But David Taylor, as I say, really should have known that the O's were at Wembley. Not been back there many times soon, and they since, and they've got a terrible record when they do in playoffs and the FA Trophy very most recently. What the defeat we had to suffer, but it's still a record. Of course, Spurs did so as well when they were in between moving stadiums. Played there quite a bit, but the O's were there first.
Arsenal was just in the Champions League, was it?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I remember Arsenal playing Champions League, presumably before they went to the Emirates. Yes, I remember that, and getting very good crowds there, sort of 60, 70,000 there as well. But the O's were the first.
So talking about the name there, how does it sit with fans of the club, or is it just so long ago, like Clapton Orient, Leyton Orient? Is it okay that there's been these name changes, or the?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they were, both Clapton and Leyton were the districts in which they were playing. They're not far apart, only a few miles apart in East London, and they started in Clapton. And say had this row and dropped the name altogether before coming back to Leyton Orient. As interesting is why the name Orient, in the hashtag only one Orient, is quite popular with Orient supporters, and it actually came effectively from the P&O Orient shipping line, because some of the earliest members who started the club worked for the firm which became P&O. And so they decided Orient was a little more interesting than Clapton Town or Clapton City or whatever. And they have, apart from one very small club somewhere who claimed that they were Orient as well, and so it wasn't only one Orient. They've obviously remained the rather like Aston Villa with that distinctive name.
It's when you just explained that, I thought to myself, it's never occurred to me why they called that, and I guess that's...
No, you don't, do you? It's one of the sort of things you take for granted sometimes without unless you get a feature called something like Strange But True in these magazines, where they explain some of these things that you really never thought of. But no, it would have been very much the same for many people, I'm sure.
Okay, so on one of the other letters that's been sent in is John Dinsdale, is the vice chairman of Halifax Town Young Supporters Club, and he wants to know who has the final word in the naming of goal scorers. The shoot says there's no official record of the names of goal scorers. The referee is only concerned with the number of goals, not the goal scorers. The names that appear in the papers have been supplied by the reporters at the match, and fascinating to know that at this point there wasn't an official record of it, or you didn't have to supply that information.
No, and very frustrating if you're writing these sort of history books that I do. Frequently, it could even be who scored the first ever goal for Aston Villa or some major club or something. I mean, quite something quite notable like that. And to be honest, in the early newspaper reports of the time, which I love ploughing through online, you get them online these days. Frequently, you read there was a scramble and the ball was put between the posts, and you wonder from that, all these club statisticians do claim to have got all the scorers from every season and so on, and own goals is again a classic. We seem to have come to some sort of agreement these days that if the ball is going in anyway, you give it to the goal scorer, whereas if it was maybe going wide or going high or something, that it counts as an own goal if it's not something more deliberate. But it is one of the things which infuriates statisticians, I'm sure, down the league. And as you say, 1970, which, by the way, is the sort of time I still think of as quite recent, up until 1970, people were still arguing about them.
Yeah. I was curious about the name John Dinsdale, and I realise it's a Yorkshire, it must be a Yorkshire name, but I was wondering if it was maybe related to Rhys Dinsdale. Rhys Dinsdale, who's a Huddersfield Town supporter, so certainly the same neck of the woods.
Yes, no, good point. I'll try and look that up for my next book, which is about Yorkshire. So Halifax Halifax and Huddersfield will be well represented. I will check out Reece Dinsdale.
Excellent. On to page 11. Hinton's free kicks are costly to opponents. So this is about Derby County's Alan Hinton, and there's a nice picture of him delivering a ball. And it says, watch Alan Hinton of Derby County take a corner kick and you watch a master. He swings them with slide rule accuracy just under the bar. Everyone a nightmare to defenders. The ball comes over hard at first, then curves slowly in and goal. He also takes all the penalties and didn't miss one during the season. Hinton also reckons he takes 99% of the free kicks. Now, manager Brian Clough says there is no better player in the game at getting the ball away to advantage when under pressure than Alan Hinton. No matter how tight a spot he finds himself in, he always finds a man with his parting pass. Hinton doesn't take all the credit for the goals that have come from his delivery, saying a lot of success is due to the way in which the players run off the ball. So Alan, he played for Wolves, Forest, Derby County before moving to the States and has 3 England caps and 1 goal.
It's always played, or mostly played on the left wing. And I wonder, just looking at that photo as well, which is my sort of image of him on his right foot, I wonder if he was one of the earliest players who actually played on the side which wasn't his natural foot. The disappointment in that photo for me is he hasn't got his white boots on, because he was definitely one of those players like Alan Ball, who was among the first to wear the white boots. But he did become a very decent winger, and we mentioned the lack of wingers slightly at the time, but he was one of those who kept going even 4 years after England's World Cup win. And Cloughy clearly was the manager who got the best out of him. It was a very good Nottingham Forest team that he played for in about 67. They were actually runners-up to Manchester United in the league and got to the Cup semi-final. I think we're going to see a photo of them later when they were just in decline a little bit, but still had some very good players. He was definitely one of those who, like John Robertson, took a player who other managers hadn't rated quite so much and got the best out of him in the same position. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so moving on to a 2-page spread with colourful, and it's very colourful. It's the men for Mexico, and it's some of the players that will be going to Mexico with England for the World Cup, where England will be defending their crown. Now, first up is Martin Peters of Spurs, and he's decked in an all-red England kit, and he's kneeling down to tie his shoelaces. I'm guessing that kit's pretty much like the 66 kit, apart from the red shorts is added to it. Would that be right, or is it significantly different?
Yes, I don't remember all that, wearing that kit all that time. But yes, they've got Emlyn Hughes moving on in the same strip as well. So it was very much the second to, I think, most England, I think, were probably happy to have just the 2 kits in those days rather than these days where you never know what they're going to turn out in. And the red was of course, red in the World Cup final, but with white shorts. Though fashion had moved on far enough for them to be all in red shorts and socks by then.
Yeah. So you mentioned Emlyn Hughes there. The other photographs are of Jackie Charlton, and I'm assuming that's going to be his Leeds United. I mean, it could be the white England kit, but it's hard to say. And Peter Benetti, who what I miss from the game is goalkeepers wearing outfield shorts and socks, which he is wearing here for Chelsea, and just with a red top. So I miss it. I mean, goalkeepers now just wear the all same colour, isn't it? It's one of those things that's just came into the game, and I think I like where goalkeepers had outfield kit as well. But in the there's a little article as well, and there's mentioned that Sir Alf Ramsey says about Martin Peters that he'll have an important role at the competition, and also with Peter Benetti, it says that he's had his international appearances limited because of the brilliant form of Gordon Banks, but is a great keeper to call on if needed. Now, as we know from that World Cup, Peter Benetti did get his chance due to food poisoning, I think it was, with Gordon Banks, wasn't it? Whereas Martin Peters played in all 3 of the group games, and he would score in the second half against West Germany, I think they were playing. So England were 2-0 up, and as we know, Peter Benetti didn't have his greatest of games, and England went on to lose 3-2 that game. So from 2-0 up, they lost 3-2 to West Germany. I think Ramsey took them off at 2-0 up, I think.
Yes, it's a day I remember very well because 1970, this May 1970, I was coming up. Well, I was just 19, and I was about to go to Germany for 3 months to work because I was on a sort of gap year, and because I was about to study languages at university, I was going out to Hamburg to work for 3 months. So on the game you mentioned, the World Cup quarter-final, I was actually watching on TV in a room full of Germans. And as the only Englishman, I was quite perky when England went 2-0 up, and a bit less perky at the final whistle. Though because they were all working in a hospital, and because they were all very nice doctors and nurses and health workers, they were not too unkind to me. It wasn't a great crop. I imagine that maybe the magazine and other issues had featured some of the other players because, as you say, Martin Peters was really the only one of those 4 who played regularly. Jack Charlton had been phased out by Brian LeBone, the Everton centre-half. Emlyn Hughes, I think, hardly got a game at all. He was, I think, the youngest player in the squad at that time. Became a regular, but of course, because England then failed to qualify in 74 and 78, didn't ever play at the finals. And the faith which Alf Ramsey and the rest of us had in Peter Bonetti, as you say, proved rather unfortunately to be over-optimistic. But Germany, I was always interested in German football, partly because it was one of the languages I studied, and I had a pen friend over in Munich who used to send me their marvellous Kicker magazine, which is a brilliant football magazine that still comes out twice a week. And Germany, although they'd been beaten in 66, had then done very well in 68 European Championship and were really coming to their peak around about 70, 72, 74. Beckenbauer, and up front not only Gerd Müller but Uwe Seeler, who was still there from 66, and the 2 of whom of course got crucial goals in the quarter final. So it was a great time for German football. Although they lost the epic semi-final against Italy, but the 4-3 game, if you remember. But it was quite a good time to be in Germany, despite the disappointment of the quarter final.
So before we go into the next page, I just want to point out again that Gordon Banks went down with food poisoning, and that's why he couldn't play. Because
yes, I mean, the suspicion, the conspiracy theorists, of course, felt that because England felt they had quite a rough time overall in Mexico, and that the locals were against them. Ramsey didn't help because, of course, his media relations and his sort of diplomacy was pretty terrible overall, and made no effort at all to integrate with the local people or say nice things about Mexico or Mexican food or anything. So the Mexicans weren't very much on our side. Very happy to see the Germans come through, and there were rumours, never substantiated in any way, that somebody might have slipped something into Gordon Banks's food, which caused him to miss out. But the problem, as you say, that I don't think that Bonetti had played at all before that, because there was the last group game was almost a dead game, and they probably needed just a draw, I think, against Czechoslovakia. So he did make 1 or 2 changes, like Jack Charlton, for instance, got a game. But Bonetti, as Alf says, had just not had that many games at international level, and it was pretty tough for him to be thrown into that one.
Yeah. So I'm going to present a different theory as to the food poisoning thing, and it's based on the advert on the next page. So let's have a look at this. So the advert shows a black and white photo of some of the England players, but the heading reads, "What happens if foreign food gives them a bellyache?" The advert continues, "It's a risk no team manager will take in a foreign country. Every mouthful the British boys eat will be vetted by the team's doctor to make sure each meal fits into the carefully planned diet they must follow. They'll take the essential food with them from Britain, and a large part will come from Findus because there are no fresher foods." So basically, I think Findus has poisoned Gordon Banks. So there you go. There's a new theory for you. It's there in black and white.
Yes. should probably be a bit careful about what we say about them, but at least, yes, they didn't. Unfortunately, they picked out Hughes and Moore and Ball and Charlton for the photos. They didn't pick Gordon Banks. I'm not quite sure either how the doctor was supposed to vet every mouthful that they ate, but clearly something went wrong at some stage.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it just after reading the other one about Gordon Banks, and then this pops up and it's like, that's an omen. That's a definite omen. So on to pages 17 to 21. This is the What's What in football, and it's the A to Z. So it's obviously starting with A. I'm not going to go through much of them, but the likes of Aberdeen, Airdrie, Aldershot, Ajax, Arbroath, Arsenal and Aston Villa are just some of the teams included. It mentions the Astrodome in Houston, Texas, and it says it's possibly the prototype of soccer grounds of the future, an indoor air-conditioned arena which cost about 15 million and holds 66,000 pounds. Now 15 million back then is a lot of money.
I picked out that Astrodome. Actually, I mean, that's quite a nice feature. They're obviously going to run it for a lot of weeks over the summer, and it was almost like a sort of mini encyclopedia of football. Mm-hmm. Everything from Amateur Cup to Arbroath through Argentina and Arsenal and Astrodome. Yeah. And I thought, reading that it was a little bit surprising that this, in some ways, that Houston Astrodome did appear in some ways to be the sort of the stadium of the future, at least for some clubs or at some level, indoors but fully air conditioned and stuff, and holding 66,000. But it just didn't quite seem to take off. I suspect there are probably a few similar in the States, but hasn't really taken off for football in the same way.
Yeah, I guess it's 50 years later, it's about right, actually. I mean, you've got the stadiums in Qatar for the World Cup are probably going to be that sort of thing, I think they're definitely air conditioned. I think they have to be over there. But you're right. I mean, I love the fact that it mentions the Athenian League, which is described as one of England's strongest amateur competitions, centred around London and the home counties. So I like that they got a mention. The Arbroath one obviously mentions the 36-0 victory against Bon Accord. I think whenever you mention Arbroath, you have to mention that. It's part of the law. But yeah, as you say, it's quite an interesting wee thing that you could build up and just have something to read through. It mentions Australia, Austria, Ayr United and Azteca Stadium. So I don't know, was there anything that jumped out to anybody else from those pages?
Just actually the amateurs and the Amateur Cup, because of course this is 1970, and within 4 years amateurism had actually been abolished officially. Everybody could be paid if you could afford to pay them, and the Amateur Cup was no more. So I assume it was 74 off the top of my head that was the last ever they put a picture of one of the Amateur Cup finals there. Which even at that time could attract some pretty big crowds. I mean, earlier in the 50s had often attracted 100,000 at full house at Wembley. But within 4 years, the Amateur Cup would be no more, and we just ended up with this sort of modern equivalent of the FA Vase, for which I'm never quite sure exactly what the qualification is. The FA Trophy as a sort of senior non-league trophy, and then the Vase for the much smaller teams who get a day out at Wembley. But I don't think at the time that this appeared, although everybody knew about so-called shamateurism and the fact that the leading amateur players were quite clearly getting money in their boots, so much so that some of them found it not worthwhile actually turning professional, because if they had a job and they were getting small amounts even from two matches and a bit of training a week, it simply wasn't worth their while. But that would all disappear within 4 years of this article appearing.
Okay, well, we'll jump on there was a few things I was going to look at, but let's jump on to the main attraction here, which is page 23, and it's headed Orient, the Leeds of Leyton. So shoot spotlight one of the promoted clubs, in this case Leyton Orient, although at this point were they just Orient, did you say?
They were just Orient, actually, yes. Okay. Yes. Of Leyton, still playing in Leyton, but still actually Orient.
Okay, so they had recently been promoted from the 3rd Division, and it says squash between Tottenham and West Ham. Orient have always been East London's poor relations, but last season could have heralded a new era down Brisbane Road. Manager Jimmy Bloomfield brought experience and produced youngsters of sparkling potential as they swept to promotion to the second division. And Jimmy says, "My ambition for Orient in the 70s is that we should become not only a first division club, but an established and respected member of that elite league." Jimmy likens Orient's journey to that of Leeds United in the early 60s before their rise in the game. Orient captain Terry now is it Mancini or Mancini? What would it have been?
Mancini, I think.
Mancini.
Yeah, he wasn't. Yeah, no great Italian. Wasn't very much a Cockney rather than an Italian himself. So we always said Mancini. Yeah.
So he says on manager Bloomfield, "I have never known a manager who remains so in touch with the players. He keeps telling us what a good side we are, and gradually we have come to believe in him and ourselves." Some of the players mentioned include Mick Jones, goalkeeper Ray Goddard, Barry Dyson, Peter Brabrook, Mark Lazarus, who I think you mentioned earlier on, didn't you? Who's pictured in one of the photos. Now, just on that, is the BFC, is that Blackpool, the team with the BFC on there?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah. The article finishes off by asking whether Orient can afford to hold on to their bright young players and manager. Tommy Taylor, Dennis Rofe, and Barry Fairbrother are just three of those that are mentioned. So just looking at those, Tommy Taylor joined West Ham this same year and returned to Orient in 79, and he would later manage the O's between 96 and 2001. So I assume Tommy Taylor is well thought of and well remembered at Orient.
Yes, I mean the answers to the questions are that they couldn't hold on to their best players because clubs like Orient sadly never do hold on to their best players, and it's a good job they put a question mark after the Leeds of Leyton because they didn't become anything like. It was a great season, and they were champions of the third division ahead of Luton Town, who had a very good team with Malcolm McDonald, and obviously got much better crowds, as Jimmy was saying there. They got the crowds up to about 11,000, which was quite good for them. It was a sort of classic mixture, almost the cliche of mixture of young players like the ones you've mentioned, and the more experienced ones, like both happened to be wingers, Mark Lazarus, who was in his second spell at the club, and Peter Brabrook, who had played for England as long ago as 1958 World Cup before West Ham and Chelsea. So it was a very enjoyable season. And he wasn't, although it sounds a bit silly now to say were they going to emulate Leeds, he wasn't far wrong in saying that they could have got to the first division. Jimmy left quite soon afterwards. What happened was that the following season, Orient actually had a pretty terrible season in the second division because they'd gone up on the strength of a very good defence and a pretty moderate attack. And of course, what happens when you do that and get promoted is that the better teams still get through your very solid defence, but your attack doesn't score enough goals. And they got, I think, 29 goals in 42 games, which was the joint lowest in the country. And it was a very depressing season. There were endless goalless draws and 1-0 home defeats and 1-1 draws, and it was just quite depressing, and so the attendances dropped off again very quickly. But Leicester then the following season, while Orient were having this very miserable season, Leicester won the second division championship, and their manager Frank O'Farrell was taken by Manchester United. So Leicester needed a manager, and on the basis really of what Jimmy had done in getting Orient promoted, and the fact that he was a very bright man, he'd always been very respected as a sort of ball-playing inside forward in his time at Arsenal, most notably. He got the Leicester City job, and so was immediately a first division manager and did very well with them. Had a very good team there. Took Dennis Rofe, one of the young players mentioned there. And Orient got George Petchey as manager, who'd been coach at Crystal Palace, and within 1974, so within 4 years of this article, Orient went into their final game of the season, needing to beat Aston Villa to get promoted to the top division, which would have been for only the second time in their history. And Villa got a penalty and scored, took the lead, and it ended up as a 1-1 draw. And Orient have never ever got anywhere near again promotion to the top division, and of course, quite recently went out of the Football League altogether. So that was a sort of crucial moment, one of those sliding doors moments that happened in football, and it was pretty much all the way down from there on. And I think he was exaggerating the potential of the club a little bit, because as with any, in Glasgow and really any big city, if you're up against very well established big clubs, you're going to find it very difficult to attract the attendances and the support, and therefore even the owners with the financial resources and so on. So Orient basically surrounded by Arsenal, Tottenham and West Ham. Little bit of a source of irritation to some of us that I could have been grown up as a supporter of Arsenal or Tottenham or West Ham or any other of the big London clubs, but was firmly told that our family club was Leyton Orient, we were at the time. And it's really been a struggle. I mean, that season, crowds of 11,000 were regarded as really good. And they've never in their history had an average crowd of more than about 16, 17,000. And there have been days, I once went to a second division game there when they were admittedly virtually bottom of the second division, played at home to Middlesbrough, and the attendance was 2,200 for a second division game in English football, which is, in a league which is now regarded as one of the biggest leagues in Europe, never mind anywhere else. So they've always had that problem. And it's really put a bit of a limit on the ambition. We know we've seen clubs like, I suppose, Wimbledon are probably the best example, certainly in London, of clubs who go through the divisions. And but when Orient actually did it in 1962, when fortunately I was old enough to go regularly, they weren't really ever going to survive in the top division. They didn't have the money to strengthen the team. And those other clubs who got up there, Northampton at that time, the year that Orient should have gone up, the one I mentioned, 1974, the club who went up instead were Carlisle United, who of course did exactly the same, lasted one season and came down. Northampton Town, around about that time, went up earlier in the 60s, went up very quickly and came down almost as quickly. If you remember Swindon more recently getting into the Premier League, those clubs just can't cut it at that level, unfortunately, and so it's always going to be a struggle. Some of those places like Swindon and Northampton at least have got more of their own community and aren't quite surrounded by so many big clubs, but that's always going to be the struggle for Orient, sadly.
Yeah, but Andy and I know where you're coming from there, Steve. And Andy and I up here in Scotland are both Clydebank supporters. And Clydebank are obviously in relative terms on the doorstep of Celtic and Rangers, and it always sort of inhibited Clydebank's attendances. Over the years, we get a lot of people from the town going to see Celtic or Rangers, and again, the years that we got into the Premier League in Scotland, again, we would come straight back down, and didn't have the attendances, didn't have the money, weren't able to strengthen the team to any degree. So we're aware of that, being a small club in the shadow of much bigger, much more attractive footballing clubs.
Yeah, same old story, and unfortunately, I think in England, and I don't know about Scotland as well, but in England, the gap is probably getting worse. Orient, you may know, had one awful spell under an Italian owner who almost ground the club into the dust. And the time that we did go out of the Football League altogether, fortunately got back quite quickly within 2 years. And the new owners, who are very good, although the two main men are based in America, one of them is an Englishman and a long-term Orient fan, and they talk about becoming an established League One club, i.e. the third tier of English football, and maybe getting back into the Championship. But even in the Championship, you're talking at the moment about a ground with a capacity of 9,000. And you're looking at the sort of teams who come down from the Premier League into the Championship, and the sort of crowds they've got and resources they've got. I mean, we could see Newcastle United next season in the Championship. A team like Orient are not going to compete with that in any way. So they are, I think, a lot of clubs at Orient's level are becoming a bit more realistic about what they can achieve. And I've said several times about these books I write about the clubs in different areas. One of the conclusions and the themes, though it's a bit sad in a way, is that essentially the big clubs do stay big and the small clubs do stay small. And while they'll always have their great days, especially in the cup competitions and so on, and they can get up to a certain level, they're not going to stay there all that long. The West Midlands I've just done is a good example, because Aston Villa and Wolves and West Brom will always be the big clubs there, and the smaller clubs who are in that book, like Walsall and Shrewsbury and Burton and Hereford, who are now out of the league altogether, they all had their moments. They've all played in the second tier of English football, but they all got up there on pretty small crowds compared to all the rest. And I've always thought that, you know, attendance figures are a gauge in some way as to just how far your team can progress, and they tend to return to a sort of level at which really they belong.
There's a question I'd like to ask you. What would your favourite season have been? Would it have been winning the third division? Would it have been almost getting into the first division? Or would it have maybe coming back into the league? What would your favourite season?
I've always said, because I was lucky enough to be there, I was only 11 years old, but the season we did actually get into the first division, right, along with, it's 1961-62, along with Liverpool. I don't know whatever happened to them, but we went up with Liverpool and then went our different ways. And in fact, the funny thing about most of Orient's promotion seasons, there've probably been about 5, I think, in my lifetime, is that it frequently follows a very bad season. And that one was typical in 1962. They'd had a bad season the year before, and then, astonishingly, in retrospect, they got Johnny Carey as manager. Well, Johnny Carey had just been manager of Everton. He'd taken them to 5th in the first division. But Everton at that time, who were clearly the big team on Merseyside ahead of Liverpool, Everton thought 5th place wasn't good enough for them, so they sacked him, famously in the back of a taxi in London, which is why Everton supporters still talk about sending a taxi for the manager. Poor old Rafa Benitez had just had a taxi sent for him. Mm-hmm. And so Johnny Carey was the highest profile manager Orient had ever had. And with no real additions to the squad, got them promoted along with Liverpool. They were second almost the whole of the season, until literally the last week of it, when Sunderland suddenly got ahead of them on goal difference. And that very last day was the day when Orient had to win at home to Bury, and Sunderland were playing away to Swansea, who fortunately needed to win as well, because they were in a relegation fight. And it was one of those days when we had what in those days were called transistor radios, which you could take everywhere with you. Amazing invention. And so there were a lot of people at the Orient game with transistor radios, and the BBC did commentary of the Sunderland-Swansea game. So we were able to hear, there was one of those great moments when a roar goes round the ground, which tells you that something's happening at the other game. And Swansea had equalised against Sunderland. And so Orient, by fairly comfortably beating Bury, got up by 2-0. And as often happens, actually, with a newly promoted club, had an amazing start. I mean, in the month of September, in the first division, we beat West Ham, our local rivals, then Manchester United, and then Everton, who were the champions that season. Actually, Everton's biggest defeat of the season, 3-0 at Brisbane Road. But that didn't last. And of course, 62-63, this season was the season of the great freeze in England, as on Scotland as well, I'm sure. And with the disruption to fixtures and the fact that they just didn't really have the money to strengthen the squad and just left it too late, it all fell apart. But the mistake, really, Johnny Carey's one mistake, was just not strengthening the team. You know, it was the thing we hear maybe a bit less these days, because teams going up to the Premier League certainly realise they've got to spend some money. But he was one of those who said, "Oh, these lads have got us promotion. You know, let's give them a chance." And by the time they realised they really weren't good enough for the first division, it was too late. But that was the greatest season. The 69-70 promotion, say, was very entertaining. And coming back to the Football League was very important, because there were all sorts of complications. Like, if you stay out of the Football League for 3 years, you lose your academy status, and you've lost a lot of the young players and stuff. So it was very important to get back. But then as soon as that happened and we got promotion, of course, we had the tragedy of Justin Edinburgh's passing. And that made the first season in the league very difficult. And now, the current situation, we've literally had the last 4 league games postponed because the opposition in each time has been unable to get a team out, allegedly. So we're very frustrated and played fewer games than any other team in the league and are just desperate to get going again.
Yeah, well, good luck to them. I have a very good friend from university who's an Orient supporter as well. So I've had a soft spot for them over the years because of that. So
a lot of people do, which is very nice. I mean, I've never come across anyone who says, "Oh, Leyton Orient, they're a horrible club," or anything like that. And a lot of people, genuine, a lot of Tottenham and West Ham supporters who would go down there occasionally regard them as their second team, which is one of the benefits of being a smaller club in a big city, I guess.
Mm. So we're going to jump out the magazine, okay, and we're going to do a focus on yourself, Steve. So that, like in the old magazines, it would have a player where there'd be a focus on a bunch of questions. So I'm just going to ask you some questions, and if you can just give me the answers. Full name?
Stephen Richard Tongue.
Where was your birthplace?
Walthamstow, East London, not very far from Leyton Orient.
Okay, what was your first car?
It was a Ford Fiesta.
Do you remember the colour?
Red.
Okay.
Leyton Orient colours.
Who is your favourite player?
Current or ever?
Ever.
Leyton Orient's greatest goal scorer, Tommy Johnston, who in the first season that I started going regularly had a run of 18 goals in 10 games, was top scorer in the country that season, 57-58, was inevitably sold, but fortunately came back. Ironically, he was sold to Blackbird Rovers and Johnny Carey, and Johnny Carey didn't really fancy him, but he came back to Orient and had 2 more seasons, and is still the only player to have scored more than 100 goals for the O's, the great Tommy Johnston, who now has a stand named after him at the ground.
Brilliant. Okay, this next question's a given. Favourite team?
That's a Leyton Orient.
What's your most memorable match?
I've been lucky enough to do probably half a dozen World Cup finals, the first of which was not as a reporter but as a spectator. My 15th birthday present was a ticket to every game at Wembley in the 66 World Cup. I think it was amazing how easy it was to get it. I think my dad just sent off a postal order to the FA, basically, and this block of tickets came back. It wasn't quite like going online the moment they were available or anything these days. So I was lucky enough to be at Wembley the day England beat West Germany. But when I was asked this very recently, I had to say that the Orient Bury game to actually get into the top division, with beating Manchester United in second place, Orient 1, Manchester United 0, was a pretty good day as well.
Good stuff. What's been your biggest thrill? So that's just in your life. It could be anything.
Oh my goodness. I think just being able to, as a reporter, to go to all these great places at somebody else's expense, basically, to watch football. I think that a lot of journalists may become a bit blasé about that, especially after a while. But there are many countries I've been to, Mexico and Australia and places that I can't imagine I would ever have got to if it wasn't for football.
Okay. And on the flip side, what's been your biggest disappointment?
I would guess, because Orient are so important, that period under the mad Italian owner, when they actually dropped out of the Football League, would have probably to be it.
Mm-hmm. And you touched on all the countries that you've been as a journalist. What's the best country that you've visited?
Those 2 I mentioned were very interesting. Australia, I went to Australia for the Sydney Olympic Games, and Mexico 2 years running, because England did a tour before the 1986 World Cup, which I also covered. But my actual favourite is Italy, and doing the Italian World Cup in 1990, partly because I was on a Sunday paper, which meant you were effectively employed about 3 days a week, and just traipsing around Italy was probably the best taken over all the best 6 weeks of my life.
Okay, this next one may be related. What's your favourite food?
Oh, I hope that was coming. Yes, I think a bit of pasta. Very, very happy with a bit of pasta.
Okay, miscellaneous likes. So give me a couple of things that you like to do.
Well, bizarrely, I'm still playing. Walking football has become my new passion, and actually representing Leyton Orient. I always hoped I'd do it when I was about 17 years old, perhaps, but at a slightly older age, I'm able to pull on a Leyton Orient shirt and regularly represent the walking football team. For anyone who doesn't know, walking football is really catching on. Everywhere we go, we hear about new clubs and more people taking it up. It's basically a sort of over 50s sport, or over 40s for women, and women are increasingly attracted to it as well. And I think a lot of people like me basically stopped playing running football, actual football, real football, and I'd stopped for a long time until I discovered walking football in my 60s. And I've got terrific pleasure from it. And it's been increasingly organised at quite a high level. They've actually played international matches now, and I'm sure it won't be long before there are international tournaments and ever. So that's been very enjoyable in the last few years.
Okay. Miscellaneous dislikes, so give me something that drives you up the wall.
I'm getting a bit old for disliking stuff. I kind of, my age now, I just sort of let it wash over me. I mean, we probably won't want to go into politics and government and so on, but there might be a few things there that irritate me a bit. But honestly, at this age, I just try to let these things wash over me and stay calm.
Fair enough. What's your favourite TV show of all time?
Oh, goodness. Every one of these questions, I sort of start with thinking about football, and so I should probably pay a bit of homage to Match of the Day, which started when I was 13 years old and could only be seen on BBC Two in London with a very small audience, and has sort of grown since then. More recently, I've very much liked some of the comedy series like Frasier.
Okay, favourite singers? So a couple of singers.
Favourite singers, I think, maybe everybody thinks they grew up in the best time for music, but if you grew up as a child of the 60s and sort of followed the Beatles and the Stones and all the rest, I think you're entitled to say that you grew up in the best time. The Beatles had their first hit in literally the month that I went to senior school when I was 11 years old, and I think they disbanded in almost the month when I finished senior school. So that was a pretty good time to be growing up. And although tragically I didn't ever see them, I did manage to see the Stones 2 or 3 times quite early on. And really all that 60s, my music station is one of those stations that calls itself Gold and just plays old records, and that will always be the radio will always be tuned to that.
Brilliant. Who's your best friend?
Crumbs. I've actually ended up staying in touch with quite a few from school. Again, I'm sorry if every question comes back to Leyton Orient, but there must be half a dozen I went to school in Leyton, and there must be half a dozen of us who still go to Orient pretty much every week. One of whom I went to Stoke with for the FA Cup last weekend. And so we do tend to meet up there and have that in common. And I think when you've supported a club like Orient for that long, you tend to have the same sort of attitude to football and to life, and you realise that life will not be a bed of roses, and there will be disappointments along the way, but that there will be the occasional good day as well. Yeah. So really any of those half a dozen who I still see and hope I'll see this Saturday at Orient against Port Vale.
Good stuff. Okay, final question here. Which person in the world would you most like to meet?
I've often thought, I've been lucky enough as a journalist. Of course, one of the things is you do get to meet some pretty interesting people. I've interviewed Pele and George Best, who were both good fun, fortunately. But I often think never meet your heroes is not a bad not a bad motto, because they can, I know, be a terrific disappointment if you actually get to meet them in the flesh. But I think from what I've seen and heard a lot of him and read interviews and stuff, that Paul McCartney would be, he just seems a decent guy. And I think that for once it's not a football answer, but that Sir Paul would be the number one.
Excellent. Okay, that's the end of the questions. But just on that, have you seen the Get Back documentary?
Yes, brilliant.
I just watched it last week, and it was absolutely superb. And I said on Twitter that I think I've become a bit of a man crush on Paul McCartney after that, because I think he just looked fantastic and he came across really well in that.
No, he has, and to say, I think a very decent man, given that all the astonishing things that have happened to him and the wealth that's come to him. Mm-hmm. And I do appreciate that. Okay,
Tom, over to you.
Yeah, well, just on Paul McCartney, it's just how happy he looks when he realises the police are on the roof.
Yeah, brilliant.
Delighted that he's managed to get upset people. So, Steve, if you can tell us a wee bit then about your latest book, Tough Wars, the Midlands.
Yeah, it started with it was really a book about London history. So I did the London clubs because, despite, as I said, spending a few years in the Midlands when I was very young, I have lived in London most of my life. And so I thought I was writing about, they say you should always write about things that you know. And I thought if I know anything about anything these years, it's probably London football. And the thing about that was it's not just a history of the clubs, but it was everything else that was going on in London, like the formation of the Football Association and the FA Cup and things starting, and lots of Olympic Games and a World Cup and so on. And because it did pretty well, they reprinted quite quickly. The idea came to write about other areas, and so the Northwest, although we actually called it Lancashire, the Northwest with the Merseyside clubs and the Manchester clubs and the historically very important other clubs like Blackburn Rovers and Preston had been huge in the early days. That was an easy one to write. It was almost the Northwest. There was almost too many clubs in it, which is why the third one that's recently come out is called the West Midlands, and not just the whole of the Midlands. So we've ignored the East Midlands clubs like Leicester and Nottingham Forest and Derby and so on, because one of the things I've always been very keen on is to give some of the smaller clubs, perhaps with my Orient background, plenty of coverage as well as the bigger ones, because they've all got their own stories to tell and their own little rivalries. So that we did the West Midlands. Again, as I said a little bit earlier, similar story to London. I mean, one of the things that came out of the London book was that almost, over 100 years ago, the big clubs in London were undoubtedly Arsenal, Chelsea and Tottenham. And, 100 years on, apart from a few West Ham supporters and the fact that they are having a decent season, I think everyone would still agree that the three big clubs in London are Arsenal, Chelsea and Tottenham. That was the point I was making about the big clubs staying big. And so it has been the case in the West Midlands with Villa, West Brom and Wolves have always been a little bit above Birmingham, although the biggest rivalry in many ways has been Villa and Birmingham, just because they're so physically close together. Birmingham have always been struggling to keep up with Villa. They've always done quite well, and literally today, as you're talking to me, I've agreed to do a fourth one about Yorkshire, which is why the books in front of me say things like Huddersfield Town, Leeds United, Sheffield Wednesday, the history of Sheffield football, and so on. And that's just about right. What you like ideally for these books is to have about four sort of big clubs or historically important clubs like Leeds and Huddersfield and the Sheffield clubs, and then smaller ones like Rotherham and Doncaster and Barnsley, who I need to learn a lot about before I write about them.
And so where does it stop, Steve? Are you going?
Well, I might be struggling after that. I mean, I tell you one thing I have done actually. Middlesbrough is technically in Yorkshire, but I've not included them in this book because if there is one more to be done, I think it should be the northeast of England, where at least you've got three big clubs and big rivals in Newcastle, Sunderland, Middlesbrough. I actually put out a a question on one of the Facebook pages of the football historians saying, do people think of Middlesbrough as a Yorkshire club? And although one or two purists said, of course, Middlesbrough's in Yorkshire, which it is technically, it's literally right on the northern border. The River Tees is almost a boundary. People, I think, agreed with me that in terms of sort of football culture, Middlesbrough are really a North East England team, along with Newcastle and Sunderland. So it may be that becomes a final one. But I always ask for 2 years to do each of them, and so it will be. I'm only really just starting on Yorkshire, so who knows where we'll end up.
Charity partner this season is the West Dunbartonshire Community Food Share. This is a charitable organisation that provides various services and support to the local community, including the following: a school uniform bank, school holiday brunch bags, food provisions, Christmas toy bank, cooking and growing lessons, and a baby bank. They provide essential support to the local community in supporting individuals and families, and we will be looking to support them in any way we can through the podcast. This will include drives for donations of food, money and support in the form of volunteers. We will also be raising awareness of the group to highlight the work that they do, but also to ensure that families and individuals who can benefit from the group are aware of these vital services. You can follow them on the West Dunbartonshire Community Food Share group on Facebook or West Dunbartonshire Community Food Share.co.uk for the website, and that's West Dunbartonshire with an N. You can also donate through our Just Giving page for the charity at justgiving.com/fundraising/shoot the breeze, one word. Also keep an eye on our Twitter accounts at shoottb_podcast and at Scott's Footy Cards for updates and news on our charity partner. We'd like to say a special thank you to Pete Wiley of the Mighty Wah for the use of the Story of the Blues in the music for our show. You can catch up with Pete on petewiley.co.uk, where you can check out the details of upcoming gigs and new music. We'd also like to thank our producer Diane Jardin for her great work and support on the podcast. Please check out transmissionroom.co.uk, where you can book music recording and rehearsal facilities in Clydebank. So we're back into the magazine and we are on pages 24 and 25, and this is a centre page team photo. It's a colour team photo of Nottingham Forest, and it says Shoot presents the Merry Men of Nottingham Forest. So it's red shirts with white shorts and red socks. The shirt has a large badge on it. It looks like it's been sewn on. It's like a patch. The shirt also has a white collar and cuff with thin red stripes on them, which I quite like. And the socks have a white stripe at the top as well. Now, just one of the names I'm going to pick out is Bob McKinlay, who's a Scot from Fife, and he's the club record appearance holder with a total of 684 games. So is there any of the names that jump out to you there? Any players?
Yeah, we mentioned earlier Forest had a brilliant couple of seasons just before this, but they were now in a bit of decline. Just going along the back row, Alan Hill, who I think was probably the reserve goalkeeper at that time, became a very important assistant to Brian Clough, especially when Cloughie went back to Forest. He was always a good old Forest man. In the middle row is Ian. He's listed as Ian Moore, although a lot of the time he was known as Ian Storymore, who Brian Clough, of course, famously paraded around the baseball ground as his new signing for Derby, except that the forms hadn't actually been signed, which is why Ian Storymore ended up as a Manchester United player rather than the Derby player. Terry Hennessy, the old Welsh international who played a lot of games for Wales, next to him. Mm-hmm. And down in the front row, someone who was a decent player but became better known as a manager probably as John Barnwell, Wolves, and one of those managers who tended to move around the Midlands quite a lot. But Wolves and Stoke and did a decent job for them. But just a shame that Forest team, as I said, by then was on the way down, and I think it got relegated then within about 2 or 3 more years, went back down to the second division.
Yeah, I seem to remember Henry Newton to go to Everton. Is that right?
Henry Newton, yeah, England international wing half, yes, been there as well.
Yeah, but yeah, again, nice simple strips. quite
Yes,
prominent
and
badge on it.
obviously those photos were almost always taken pre-season, which is why they look quite nice and sunny, and why after 2 or 3 of the names it has to say that actually they're not now with Forest anymore. So one of them, Peter Grummett, the goalkeeper, is now Sheffield Wednesday, and somebody else I think have moved on elsewhere as well.
So on the next couple of pages, it's sayings of the season. So this shoots Peter Shepherd, and he looks back at some of the things said by players, managers and journalists over the season. So again, I'm going to pick a few out. And the first one is by Sports Writer of the Year, Hugh McIlvanney. And he's quoted in praise of Celtic's Jimmy Johnson, where he says, he gives the impression that he can beat 3 men in a telephone box. Which is a smashing wee thing to say. Next one, Bertie Auld takes a dig at Leeds United. He says, a good side, I'll give you that, but not as good as the Spurs side that did the double in the early 60s. They had inspiration, but this Leeds team is a machine. So, I mean, he is having a dig at them, but he also, there's a bit of respect there for him as well. Derby County boss, Brian Clough, was more positive about Leeds, saying, Leeds United are the greatest side in Europe. The way I go on about them, you would think I'm some kind of unpaid public relations man. So, yeah, there's that relationship between Brian Clough and Leeds United, which we know where that went. Now, the next one is Memories of George Best. After being torn apart by Man United in the FA Cup, Northampton Town's Ray Fairfax had this to say about George Best, who scored 6 goals that day. He says, why oh why did it have to be me that marked him? The only time I got close to him was when we went off at half time and full time. If I had to play against such a man every week, I would hang up my boots and quit the game. I'm sure a lot of people felt like that after facing George Best in his prime. Next one, Orient's getting a lot of airtime in this magazine. So
I assumed you'd picked it out especially for me this time.
So it says, Orient solved the problem of lack of support by gaining promotion to the second division. As their manager Jimmy Bloomfield stated, I can say right now that we have no intention of selling any of our players unless it's in the best interests of the club. We need about 11,000 gates to break even, and last season we increased our support from an average 3,500 to the 11,000 mark. Next season we hope to do much better. So quite a positive. I mean, he seems quite positive about everything at the moment, which is fair enough considering they've just won promotion. Plus, there's not very many managers, I guess, that underplay things and say, be quite negative. So I think that's pretty expected at that time.
Yes, no. I mean, he was more or less right. He may have exaggerated the 3,500, but it wouldn't have been all that much better than that the previous season. So they did very well to get up to 11,000. But unfortunately, as he says, and as I described, it was such a dull season. The next one that they went down to about 9,000 and struggled to get back up to that mark. And I would like to say a word about Hugh McIlvanney as well, one of the great sports writers of all time, who I was lucky enough to spend some time with. Actually, went to his funeral as well, and clearly I'd started in Scotland, came down to England, and was one of the most influential writers I remember reading when I was young. I think my dad always bought the Observer on a Sunday, and one of the first football reporters who I ever read, and clearly one of the greats.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if I'm thinking of William as well, but whenever I read anything by them, you just hear it in their voice.
Yes, wonderful voice.
Yeah.
Yes, I when I hear William interviewed about his novels, it does put me in mind of Hugh as well.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on. There's a focus on here, Frank Spraggin, which there's a couple of the responses which I think sometimes on these you get somebody and you think, was it worth actually interviewing them? If you weren't a footballer, what would you be? And he says, no idea. Okay, next one, who in the world would you most like to meet? Nobody in particular. I mean, it's like, what's the point? What's the point of this? Dislikes was shaving, losing, gardening and phony people. Gardening seems to be one that comes up a lot for footballers back then. So I don't know what the problem is there. And food, the obvious, the the trope for the focus on food is steak, but he's went for steak and fish, obviously not at the same time. And biggest disappointment when Borough bought George Cannell and I was dropped from the team. George Cannell, I know he was a Scot, I think. He maybe came from Cowdenbeath or something like that, or maybe I'm thinking his brother. But yeah, there's nothing really to pick out that's mind-blowing or anything like that.
I have a bit of sympathy because my first job after university as a full-time journalist was for a sports agency in London, which did an awful lot of work for magazines like Shoot. And this was a sort of questionnaire which we'd have been quite likely to have to ask some player to do. And I remember when I'd not been there very long at all, the boss said, here's the number of the Chelsea training ground. I want you to ring Peter Osgood and get him to do one of these. And you can offer him £5. This was in 1973, and even in 1973, £5 was not a lot of money to offer to an England footballer. And when I got through to it was easy enough in those days just to ring the training ground and someone would pick up the phone and they get Peter Osgood for you. But it was a pretty short conversation when I said it's £5 and Peter Osgood. Focus on Peter Osgood of Chelsea did not appear in Shoot, as I'm aware.
Excellent. Jumping on a few pages, so we're at the vote for the season's most exciting player. So Shoot are giving away a trophy for the most exciting player of the year in both England and Scotland, as judged by the readers. So there's a form at the bottom. I nominate as my player of the year, and the space to put the nomination in, then your name and address. And there's also a space that you put an E or an S on it, depending on whether it's the Scottish vote or the English vote. Now I'm guessing because it says this is the last chance. The previous weeks probably had I haven't checked, but the previous weeks probably had these in them as well. So I guess you could nominate, even though it says don't, you could nominate for the same player more than once, or you could nominate for the Scottish and English ones. Now I didn't check who the. Give me a quick second. I might be able to find.
I'll tell you who some candidates would have been, because 1970 was, of course, the first year of what I still call the Rothmans football yearbook, even though it's not been done by Rothmans for many years. And they actually picked their sort of most exciting team of the season, which included the ones that stood out for me. They picked the sort of 4-2-4, quite an attacking team, which had George Best on one wing and Jimmy Johnston on the other wing. Yep. And I would have thought they would have been pretty big candidates. Although, funnily enough, I think it's in this magazine. One of the letters recommends Eddie Gray at Leeds United as the most exciting. So he would have been in with the shout as well. But I think either George and Jimmy Johnston, I would have thought, got quite a lot of votes.
So I've got it here. So you're spot on with Jimmy Johnson, who won the Scottish one. The English one we've spoke about a couple of times in the magazine, and he replaced Gordon Banks in Mexico. So it was Peter Bonetti that won it.
Right.
Eddie Gray was third.
Most exciting player.
Yeah. Eddie Gray was third, and Terry Cooper, I think, maybe was second.
Yeah, he got in the Rothmans team. David Hay got in the Rothmans team as the right back.
Yeah.
So whether you can call the fullbacks that exciting, I suppose it was about the time when they started getting forward, and Terry Cooper would have been quite an exciting player, I guess, in his way.
So that's who won it that season. So there we go. And there's on the next page it's Shannon and Davies. So it's about Mick Channon talking about a dual striker role with Ron Davies. Martin Chivers had just been sold to Spurs, so his game had changed to, it was freed up more to support Ron Davies, and it just talks about how their understanding has developed as they've worked hard and played more with each other. And at this point, he's not had England caps, but he has he's eyeing up breaking into the squad for 1974 World Cup, so a few years down the line. But he would get his first cap in 72, and he got 46 in total, scoring 21 goals, which is some return that at international level. Well, I suppose at any level, almost 1 and 2, isn't it? We can't go past this double page spread, which is George at his best. I mean, it's two pages, very colourful, very red. George Best, got a full page colour photo on the right hand side where, you know, you spoke about how you know, the favourite band was the Beatles, and he's got that sort of haircut as well, isn't he? He's got the sparkle in his eyes. It just, you know, it's very good looking man there. The other photographs, Ian Ewer, Bobby Charlton, and I think they've just scored against Coventry City by the looks of it. And in the top one, he's Take a Man On.
Obviously, terrific appeal and great for this sort of magazine, a real selling point. I think he probably at some stage became a columnist for one or two of them, although he might have been, for his ghostwriter, he might have been a bit harder to track down than some of the more reliable ones to actually get any words out of. But I think, where are we, 69, 70, I'm not going to say past his peak, but didn't have many years left. I think probably even by this time he was beginning to get a little bit disillusioned with some of it, and I think didn't really enjoy Franco Farrell very much. We saw the photo of Wilf McGuinness as manager. He didn't really enjoy working with Wilf very much either. He'd been one of those who's very much under Matt Busby's spell, I think, and once Busby moved on, a lot of them found it a lot harder. And Wilf McGuinness, having been, you know, very much of an age of some of these players, although a bit older than George, found it very hard to impose the discipline on them, as often happens when you get an old teammate who then becomes coach or manager. And I think within, by about Christmas 72, which was when Franco Farrell got the sack, it was all beginning to fall apart for United, and George was just losing interest and missing training, and probably drinking more as well. And it was a bit sort of beginning at the end, and by 74, of course, was the year when they actually got relegated. I mean, I say to young people now, yes, I remember Manchester United getting relegated, and they think I'm having them on. But it happened within, 6 years of them winning the European Cup. So you can see the appeal to the editors of the magazine like this, that a full colour page of George Best was likely to put on a few sales, probably, especially among the female readership as well.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say that I think I sort of thought we'd talked about him earlier on, but it was when we were talking about Jimmy Greaves, and it's just the parallels to it. It was
sad. You know, two real icons of the 60s we think about, and by the time it got into even 1970, they were beginning that downward slope.
And I mean, as you mentioned with Jimmy as well, he played with smaller clubs as well, but he went up to Scotland, played with Hibs, and that was a bit of a disaster, I think, generally. And
I think I saw one of those games. We had I was on local radio, and local radio didn't start till 73, so it must have been after that. We used to have meetings of all the sports editors from all the commercial stations in Britain, and we went up to the Edinburgh station, was it Radio 4th, in Edinburgh, and it coincided. We deliberately timed the meeting to coincide with a match that George was playing at Hibs, and saw him up there. I actually also, I do take every occasion possible to mention this. I played both against him and with him, against him in a charity match at a little Southern League ground called Welling, very near where I live. I turned out occasionally for the TV commentators 11, although I was never a TV commentator. I claim as a radio commentator that I had some sort of qualification. Martin Tyler, who still does Sky, used to run the team, and he got me to play. I was always played at right back, and George, of course, was on the left wing, and spent most of the game nutmegging me until I got a little bit fed up with this. I was quite appreciative of the fact that a lot of people had come to see George Best play, but nobody had come to see Steve Tongue play at right back. And so on one occasion, I managed to close my legs at just the right time, nick the ball away. Martin Tyler always says, "Oh, I remember you doing that lap of honour when you tackled George Best." It wasn't quite a lap of honour, but it was probably the best moment of my very ordinary football career. And then the occasion I was lucky enough to play with him is about mid-80s, 84, 85. so he was long retired. But the Football League started their new competition for third and fourth division clubs, and they decided rather ambitiously to play the final at Wembley, but they were very worried about how many people were actually going to turn up. Although they were quite lucky in that Brentford got into the final, as I mentioned earlier, are quite near Wembley, so there were a decent number of Brentford fans. But they played Wigan, who at that time were a very lowly, quite new Football League club, were not expected to bring hardly any fans at all. And so they approached us as a local London radio station and said, could you get a team up if we got an England, they call it something like an England 11, and so we had an LBC team, which included George Best, Pat Jennings in goal, various other personalities who we'd had. I think Rod Stewart was supposed to play, but I'm not sure he made it because he's certainly not in any of the photos. But I thought I'd better let George be captain rather than me. So George led us out, and there's a photograph which got in one of the Sunday papers of George leading our team out next to Bobby Moore leading out the opposition, who also had Bobby Charlton. I don't think they had Jeff Hurst. We had Moore and Martin Peters and Bobby Charlton, but not Jeff Hurst. But so that was the day I played at Wembley.
Brilliant. I think around about 79, 80 is when he came to Hibs. Is that about right, Tom?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it that? Yes, that late. Yeah, well, that makes sense. That makes sense.
It'd be interesting to know which game it was, but there was many stories about him not turning up for games or turning up a bit too worse for wear and things like that. I think there's a story about him partying with the French rugby side in Edinburgh. I think that was the reason why he missed one of the games. He just basically partied with them and forgot about the football. But yeah, as you say, it's a cracking photograph, and certainly one for the
also the action picture there with the shirt outside the shorts, which I'm sure a few managers would have disapproved of, but all part of the image.
Yeah. And I love it. I'm going to guess at Everton they're up against there. I don't know if it is.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
But I just love that you can, the Everton player's got his back to us, but you can sort of just sense that there's a trepidation there.
Yeah, that was how I felt when he ran at me.
Yeah, brilliant stuff. Just going to move on to the back page then. Bert Patrick. So it's Bert Patrick of Preston North End. Now again, this is one of the things I like about the magazines, is lots of different teams were covered. It wasn't always just the top teams and things like that, which as Tom says, we're Clydebank supporters, and as you know, being an Orient supporter, it's good when you get coverage of your team. I don't really know where were Preston at this time. Were they?
Preston had just gone down with Villa in the season I mentioned. Sensationally, really, the pair of them going down. Although Preston came straight back up, but I'm not sure that Patrick wasn't a name that meant anything to me at all, I must confess, and I'm not sure he played much of a part in them getting back up, because according to the record books, he went off to Barrow for one season, and then finished altogether. But no, as you say, I mean, the idea that a player like that could get a full... I hope someone got him a copy of the magazine. You'd like to think that he's still got a copy of it that he shows to his grandchildren and says, I was there one day. Yeah. Because it's not a name that's going to live in the memory of your average football fan all that long, unfortunately. Yeah,
as you say, I mean, 57 appearances he made for the club that I found out, and he was released in 1971, so the following year he was released. He joined Preston in 63 and made his debut in 65, so he was there a good few years, but obviously to make just 57 appearances in 8 years or 6 years of being in the first team, why would that warrant him being in the back page of the leading, or one of the leading football magazines at the time? It's crazy. But I will point out he was a Scottish defender as well, so certainly not a player I really recognised or heard much of, so I've no idea what the criteria was, or who would at Shoot Magazine would say, let's get this person or let's get that person. So I thought it was a good way to finish it. So thank you. Listen, Steve, thank you for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I hope you've enjoyed going through this. So in terms of your books, where can people get them? I think Pitch Publishing is the most recent one. Is that right?
Yes, Pitch have done all my books, and they do put out an awful lot of football books, many of which are very decent quality and reasonable value too. They have a good link up with Waterstones booksellers, so any Waterstones near you will at least order the books. If they don't have them in stock, you can always just mention Turf Wars and Tongue. And one of the benefits of having a rather odd surname is that it's easy to find and easy to look up, and people tend to remember it a bit more. So they've been very enjoyable to do. They're all available on Amazon, which I think means the author gets about 5 pence for every book sold on Amazon. So if you can find a Waterstones, I'd be ever so grateful if you've got it from them.
Definitely. So what else are you involved in? I noticed that you have a agent. Would an agency be the right word for it?
Yeah, it's really that's really run by my daughter Jo. It's called Tongue Tied Media, and she represents a lot of people, mainly media commentators, people like Dion Dublin, Dean Ashton. But she's very keen on women's football, and she got into women's football just around the time it was beginning to take off down here now as it is. So she actually represents a few women's football players, including Leah Williamson at Arsenal, who's been captain of England recently, and so on. And she's on the board of Women in Football, which is an increasingly influential body as the FA in particular and football in general takes a bit more account of the fact that women make up 50% of the population and are now allowed to play football again after the FA banned them for about 50 years or whatever it was. So she's very active in that, and I don't play much of a role. My main role, I think, was to speak to the bank manager before we started and say that I'd be some sort of guarantor. That's my most important role by far. But our Jo does a very good job on that, and it's been very interesting for her actually.
Mm. And so I know you're on Twitter. Where can people find you on Twitter if they want to follow?
I'm at Steve Tongue, which is pretty unoriginal, but finds me. I still present, do a bit of radio. I do a program called the Orient Hour, which goes out every week. Gets quite good cooperation from the club. I do present that once a month, which is just from a local radio station in Essex, and occasional article for Backpass magazine, which is a sort of retro magazine that has quite a devoted following from people of sort of a slightly older age group who love the 60s and 70s and all these periods, 60s, 70s, 80s. So I've got to interview quite a lot of old London stars who fortunately are always happy to talk and never mention the money as some of the more modern ones do, which is a blessing.
Excellent. Again, thank you very much. We hope you've enjoyed it. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Yeah.
I have. Great fun. Thanks ever so much for your time.
Great stuff. And so just like to say a big thank you from myself and for Tom for being Tom. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Andy.
And as always, please follow the podcast on Twitter. It's shoottb_pod. We also have an associated website as well where you can follow along with the magazines as well as you listen to it. So please take your time out for that. And Western Bartonshire Community Food Share is who we're in partnership with, a charity partner. So check out the Western Bartonshire Community Food Share as well. And so we hope you've enjoyed it. Until the next time, let's shoot the breeze.